it's not as simple as it sounds. There will be a grave language issue. None of these North Koreans are used to combat. They've got no experience with the weapons, etc. So that would actually be quite tricky. What is potentially, I suspect, more likely is that they get used to bolster the defences of Russia and liberate Russian soldiers to go and join the front line. The problem, of course, with all of this, though, is you can also end up with defections from the North Koreans.
The US have said they've seen evidence that North Korean troops are operating in Russia for the first time. It comes after South Korean lawmakers said they believe North Korea sent 3,000 troops to help Putin's war effort and are planning to send thousands more. We've heard that this is the case, likely the case from the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And the US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's also been speaking today, warned this could have implications around the world.
If they're co-belligerents, their intention is to participate in this war on Russia's behalf. That is a very, very serious issue, and it will have impacts not only in Europe, it will also impact things in the Indo-Pacific as well.
Both Moscow and Pyongyang have denied the claims. Let's speak to Sean Bell now, defence analyst. Sean, can you spread any more light on this? I wonder what some of the defence community is saying here about North Korean troops in Russia.
Yeah, good evening, Kate. I think you have to start with what's the need. I mean, Russia is clearly running short of troops in its war with Ukraine. It doesn't want to do another round of mobilization. That will be deeply unpopular in Russia. And Putin's tried bringing in mercenaries, but the supply of those has dried up. So he desperately needs troops and artillery and ammunition. And of course, North Korea is desperately being isolated. It needs money and it needs more ammunition. So in a way, this is a sort of marriage made in heaven. The numbers are a bit concerning. You reported 3,000. Various reports talk about 1,500, but up to 12,000 North Korean troops potentially moving into Russia. The challenge, of course, is how are they going to be used? It's one thing going to Russia be training, but how are they going to be used?
Yeah, and that is the question. What is your suspicion here?
Well, the clear implication of Lloyd Austin and some of the quotes you made is that they're planning to use these troops on the front line. That would be a grave concern, but it's not as simple as it sounds. There will be a grave language issue. None of these North Koreans are used to combat. They've got no experience with the weapons, etc. So that would actually be quite tricky. What is potentially, I suspect, more likely is that they get used to bolster the defences of Russia and liberate Russian soldiers to go and join the front line. The problem, of course, with all of this, though, is you can also end up with defections from the North Koreans. They're not famously, loyal to North Korea. So it'll be interesting to see how that would play out. The wider implications, though, is that if North Korea actually gets involved in fighting, in other words, they join the war, then is North Korea a legitimate target for Ukraine and potentially the West? And if they're not a legitimate, if they do get involved, but they're not a legitimate target, then of course that opens the door for the West to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute the West has an appetite for doing that, but we are, I think, on the cusp of seeing things like a no-fly zone, a Western no-fly zone implemented in the west of Ukraine. There are some concerns about that, but they will start to ease away if North Korean troops are involved.
Yeah, and your point about whether those troops, because it's kind of a shadowy, secretive country, North Korea, they don't often let people out, do they, let alone thousands of troops. And there is a wider question, really, about whether those troops will remain loyal to North Korea, especially if they do engage in on-the-ground action. They might feel that they want to run away in the opposite direction.
Yeah, they might do. Unfortunately, there's also been all sorts of reports about what's happening to those families of those North Korean soldiers. There are various reports they're being corralled together, being carefully fed a diet of misinformation. And of course, if you're the soldiers heading away, you're undoubtedly going to be threatened that if you run away, your families will be treated to a very, very uncomfortable demise. So I suspect there'll be all sorts of measures in place. I think what's also worrying, though, is that North Korea, we in the West have successfully isolated North Korea and from a credible engagement with the community, it'll feel emboldened by this. It's needed by Russia. It's being paid currency by Russia, and that'll all embolden North Korea. And that's one of the reasons South Korea is so worried about this, that they've always worried. The war has never really ended between North and South Korea. If North Korea feels that it's got a partnership with a major superpower like Russia, it might feel bold enough to start considering offensive action. All of that leads to an increase in global instability, and that's not good for any of us.
No. Does it make Russia look a little desperate if they're having to bring in North Korean troops, or is it all about diplomacy?
I've heard
A
some
weird
reports
sort of
of people
diplomacy,
talking
I should
about,
say.
yeah, and I've heard some reports talking about desperation. The dangers, I've been sort of involved in this, and these grey hairs have been involved in this for quite some time now. And we in the West clearly support Ukraine, and therefore we like to frame Russia as being desperate. The fact is that Russia is on the front foot in the Donbass. It is making grinding progress at the moment. And the more troops that it can push into that theatre, the more it'll accelerate its push into Ukraine. And of course, the absence of Western weapons in the supplies that are needed are making life very difficult for Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's all about winning. And at the moment, anything that helps Russia, and this appears to be helping Russia, will definitely be in Putin's game plan. So we can frame it as desperation. I'm not sure that's quite true.
Ukrainian military intelligence expects North Korean soldiers to start turning up on Wednesday in Russia's southern Kursk region. That's what we've heard from Lieutenant General Budanov, head of Ukraine's intelligence unit. So he spoke to the US publication The War Zone yesterday. It's unclear at the moment how many and or how they'll be equipped, as you've been saying, Sean. We'll see after a couple of days. So look, all indications are that North Korean troops are over there. Are you surprised by this? I mean, it does seem like a fairly odd mix of personnel on the surface, but I suppose, Sean, as you've been digging into it, such as this a boon for North Korea, and could potentially help Putin out at the same time. It does make sense for both parties.
Well, Putin and Kim Jong-un both signed a security pact earlier on this year, and they talked about relationship with few limits. Russia's been doing the same with China as well. And I suspect, whilst individually each of those countries have their own agendas, collectively they are starting to coalesce around a sort of axis of evil as a counter to the sort of what they see as the US-led NATO. And in a way, this is that's the worry, that rather than these isolated countries, as they start to coalesce with Iran for supplying weapons, North Korea supplying weapons, Russia hosting the latest BRICS and inviting loads more countries to join, it's trying to incite that sort of sense that NATO isn't the only game in town. And again, that all leads to an air of instability around global security.
Look, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for being with us. That is Sean Bell there, who is a defence analyst.